I'm here with Dr. Caroline Mitchell from the University of Sunderland, and she's got a very interesting kind of portfolio going on. So, hi Caroline, how are you?
Hello, good afternoon. I'm fine, thank you. End of a long week.
Yes, it is the end of a long week. So I'd like to start with a little bit of a brief overview of your career, starting with your work in the media and in radio, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine. Yes.
So when did you start working in the media, and what drew you to this profession?
Well, I've really been doing it since I was a student, which is a very long time ago. I actually was originally interested in sort of theatre studies, and I did quite a lot of, amateur dramatics and all that kind of thing. And but I actually, when I was having my careers advice at sixth form, my careers teacher said, have you thought about broadcasting? And I really genuinely didn't know much about that at that time. It wasn't seen really as a big career. But I found a degree that was one of the first degrees actually in media. It was set up to partly to train people to work at the Open University. They wanted people with education and broadcasting skills together, so that's what I did. And while I was doing that degree, which was a sort of quite a critical degree as a media, it was a sociology and history and practical stuff, I learnt a couple of things, and one of them was that I really like radio above television. I found radio more accessible and more personal, and I found the television industry, and even then within my university, there was a lot of sexism. So making programs, would you believe it, the technicians often wouldn't let out equipment to the women on the course. Really? Yes. I mean, this is going back to the sort of late 80s. So, the late 70s. So, I actually, my dissertation was quite risky. It was about sexism in the broadcasting industry, and I was sort of blowing up a few things to do with the actual course as well. So that was where I sort of started having a critical stance towards the media and looking at sort of who was broadcasting, who was able to broadcast, and what the media was set up for. So I also, during my degree, did some research about alternative radio, pirate radio, community radio, and I first started working, in fact, in sort of community arts and media when I left university. And to be honest, ever since then I've had one foot in each sort of camp, one foot in education and one foot in broadcasting itself. And I have always been working within sort of alternative and oppositional frameworks relating to media. So the kind of work I've done, although I have done some work in commercial radio and BBC and things like that, most of it has been involved in setting up new ways of new forms of broadcasting. And for a very long time in this country, the radio was dominated by commercial and BBC, and so I spent quite a lot of my sort of early days working to set up new structures of broadcasting, and very much influenced by what was going on in the States, in Australia, in Europe actually, setting up sort of community-based stations. And I was part of the early campaign to do that, and part of the original Community Radio Association, which lobbied the government over many, many years to do that. I've tended to earn my living in education and research, and I have broadcast in the community sector and helped set up new structures in that. The thing that I sort of did that I suppose started off my academic career properly was I was involved and was one of the two coordinators of a station in Bristol called FEM-FM.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah, I've heard about this.
So basically I was working in commercial radio in Bristol and was doing some community things, and was very aware, along with many other women in Bristol, of just how in the sort of mid-80s, late 80s, early 90s, if you were listening to radio in Bristol, you would virtually not hear any women's voices, which might seem very strange for people thinking about that and listening now, but there were really very few female DJs on national radio and on local commercial radio as well. So there were some short-term licenses available called restricted service licenses, and we basically got one of those to demonstrate how women were able to do any job in radio, and so we broadcast a station called Fem FM, and it was about 200 women involved, and basically women did everything, including setting up the transmitter and producing every program, marketing, jingles, DJing, fundraising, a lot, and it had quite a good effect. People really liked it. It was really, quite a short-term burst of sort of feminist radio, if you like. But people really liked it, and the people involved in it got a real buzz out of it. And it was the first women's radio station in the UK. And after that, there were quite a few others. And also after that, the mainstream media started doing things like making sure that on International Women's Day, which is the day it was it started, that there were better representation of women, women's issues, women's interviewees, and so on. So after that, I sort of realised there was I was still teaching and broadcasting, but I was interested in researching this area, and so that's when I started writing and doing research and putting together a sort of an edited volume of the research that there was in the sort of mid to late 90s. And that book was called Women in Radio, Airing Differences. And that led me to sort of looking at the sort of the small amount of research that was going on then about women in radio. And that was coming from historians who were sort of trying to, saying that actually history itself was quite sexist. So the histories of broadcasting really ignored the fact that there were, for instance, many women producers at the BBC.
Yeah.
And setting up people like Hilda Matheson, who helped set up or led setting up of BBC News, and many others, and also research about the sort of particular relationship women have with radio, and how the sort of industry tended to position women as audiences, and there was a whole time in the 70s and 80s where it was sort of thought of that women were sort of the whole audience were housewives, which was patently not true, but it was the male DJs were sort of positioning women very much in that area. So I did some work around that. I started working at the University of Sunderland in the mid-90s, and from there was both teaching and also doing research, and also supporting the setting up of a third sector of radio, community radio. And to cut a long story short, that sort of sector is now set up in the UK. There's over 250 stations, and my research then sort of continued to be interested in women in radio, and I did some work in Europe and looking at different models of radio stations, but I also became generally interested in sort of how community stations worldwide provided a voice for minorities, not just women, but any group who had been excluded from broadcasting.
Yeah.
And my research was about sort of how to make that happen, really. And I've always done very practical, sort of action-oriented research. So a lot of the work I was doing was really about doing it, about helping people set up things and looking at the kind of methods that were best to sort of enable people to broadcast, to have a voice, to sustain stations, and so on.
Yeah. Can I just go back a little bit to the Fem FM? When
Sure.
you say that, like, it was all run by women, and the women were doing all of the different areas in the radio, I find that really interesting because I've had some experience working with radio before, and I do find it now still very male dominated. And it's kind of, that stereotype of women aren't interested in these technological sides. Did you find it difficult to find women to fill those positions, or is it literally so easy to find them?
Well, just to give you an example, yes, there are these perceptions, and actually, there are lots of reasons why there have been quite a small pool of people in particular areas, and a lot of it is to do with sheer sexism. That I actually wrote in my book. I mean, I was told by a technician once that he didn't think women should edit because they might get their fingernails stuck in the tape spools, which then we were using. So there was just pure, just sexism that sort of sustained this, and that there are letters that are available in the archives where women who'd applied for jobs in engineering are just told, no, the BBC does not employ women in engineering. When we were doing FemFM, we did have some male supporters who helped. There were no female engineering companies to provide transmitters.
Yeah.
So we hired our transmitter from a small group. But in terms of engineering programs and driving programs, we found a fantastic group of women who worked as studio managers at the BBC World Service.
Yes.
And there's a great story with that, where actually they heard about FemFM in London, and they knew that we were making programs, but they also knew that we need, in terms of setting the studio up and running the programs, making sure we were logging everything and making sure everything sounded great. So they basically they rang us up and said, we'll come and manage that side of things, and studio managers have great training. It's not something at that time many women went into, but there were women at the BBC that did it, and they actually they worked in shifts. They used to do their shifts at the BBC and then get on the train and come down to Bristol and work and work some shifts with us.
That's incredible.
And it was great that they were then role models for other women, but women, at that time, we spent a lot of time making sure we could get equipment and access to equipment. And another nice story, the BBC in Bristol, in the evenings and the weekends, any women who were working there used to let us in, and we used to edit all weekend at BBC Bristol using the equipment there. So it's like the women were opening the doors, sometimes literally, to make sure that we had the resources we needed for editing programs and things like that.
That sounds incredible. I love that idea of just locating the women who could do the job and then them teaching other women, because it's such an easy concept to think of. You just have to teach people how to do things, but if there's that perception...
Yes, exactly. And radio is not a complicated thing. I mean, there are skills, and you can make good radio, creative radio, and bad radio. But what we did was we got all the women we knew who were doing it to be actors, role models and trainers for all the rest of the people. And so that in itself became a sort of a metaphor, if you like, for how to do things. It's amazing. At that time, there was a lot of commercial radio people and BBC people who were saying, oh, we'd really like women to do these jobs, but they just don't apply. And Ros Gill, who's quite a well-known feminist media academic, she talked about how she looked at the discourse of this, and she actually realised that men were deflecting the blame for the sexism within the industry by all the time coming up with reasons why women supposedly had responsibility for not being involved. So they'd say women don't apply for the jobs. Now what we did is that we put out lots of publicity, we ran competitions, and women just came to us because they thought, well, this is great, I'm going to learn, or I've got some knowledge and I'll help do this. The programme controllers often said that women wanted to do particular areas and not others, whereas we found that, so for instance, they said they don't really want to be DJs, and things like that. And we found, I think we had about 45 DJs, music presenters doing different styles of music. So it was really a showcase. And I still meet women who are involved. In fact, about 25 years after FemFM broadcast, we had a reunion, and we actually sort of we've got an archive of the station. And there were now women, of course, in quite senior positions in broadcasting, and they all said what a pleasure it was to be in an all-women environment. And I think one of the areas we need to look at still is the sort of culture that sort of enables sexist sort of behaviours and cultures to grow. And I think since then we all know that actually at the BBC there was quite a toxic culture, and that led to a lot of sexism and even abuse. I think we need to look at what makes a healthy culture in a radio station and make sure that everyone is supported to be able to work there.
So you work at the University of Sunderland now, and I know that Spark Sunderland, the university radio station, does a lot of good stuff for young people. I know a lot of people who have come out of Spark Sunderland and gone very easily into mainstream media and gotten jobs in the media. Do you help with Spark Sunderland in these areas, specifically with sexism?
When I went to Sunderland, I was the only radio lecturer, and we sort of built up the team there. And as soon as full-time licences were advertised, we've been doing practice stations and a bit like MFM, we've been doing some one-off things so that students had lots of experience of doing live broadcasting. But as soon as the stations were advertised, my colleague Richard Berry and I, we applied for the licence and got it for Spark. So we're now I think it's been going for about 12 years now. And basically it is a live lab, and it's a live real broadcasting situation, and it's not just a student radio station, although obviously a lot of students are involved. It is a community station aimed at young people, so we have always had it as a way of trying out new program formats, working with young people in different areas and doing specialist programs that are of interest to students and young people. And it's very much run on a community model, although some of it might sound a bit more commercial than others, and some of it might sound a bit more BBC because some of the tutors are BBC producers. Yeah. But it's basically we look at access. We get people on air as soon as possible. We encourage people to experiment and learn on the job. But you're right, it's a fantastic way for people to get jobs. And honestly, we have modules throughout the undergraduate course, but we've had an MA in radio for about 15 years, and that gives people the chance not just to broadcast, but to manage the station and to also manage related projects. So for the moment, we've just finished recording a pilot program for a program about youth and community work, and we're doing that in conjunction with youth and community workers who are being also trained at Sunderland, and that will become a podcast as well. So it's actually we do live broadcasting, but podcasting is very, very key part of the radio industry now. So we also teach people about podcasting and taking some of the best sort of parts of creative radio production into podcasting to make, because obviously some podcasts can be a little basic. Yeah. So which is it's fine. Yeah. It's fine, and they're targeted. And I really I listen to, for instance, a podcast about line of duty, and it is three people in the studio talking, and it's fascinating because it's so specialist. But we also think that some podcasts can be crafted and made more like really good radio documentaries and dramas. So so Spark has been fantastic, and it's really well supported by the university. The students can do so many things. Just this week, most students have been learning how to record a live, do a live OB battle of the bands from the student union, and fantastic experience for them.
That sounds amazing.
They also get experience of working on BBC projects, and we've got a really good relationship with BBC Radio 3, and we make a programme from Sage Gateshead every year as part of the Free Thinking Festival, and we also this year we've worked with 5 Live on one of their live programmes that was broadcast from Sunderland. So it is a big strength at Sunderland anyway. So we do a lot of radio, not just community radio, but radio to prepare students to go into different parts of the industry.
So you've clearly got a huge passion for radio, and I think it's an amazing format. Having a look around on the internet, I had a look at Radio Garden, which is, I think, the most wonderful unusual thing I've ever seen before in my entire life. So can I just ask exactly how did the idea come about? What is the idea? Because I haven't actually said what the idea is.
Radio Garden is a beautiful thing. So basically, in about 2015, I was part of a sort of international radio research project, which is quite unusual to get finance for that kind of project. Radio is quite a sort of minority medium in some ways, but we were lucky enough to get Sunderland was part of a project, and we were researching the way that radio crosses borders in a transnational way. Mm-hmm. So it is, one of the amazing things about radio is that it can link people up, the BBC World Service, for instance, and also community radio, because often community radio is used to link communities whose, for instance, may not be living in the same area as their homeland. So it might, for instance, in Newcastle we have Spice FM, which is broadcast in different languages and promotes cultural understanding in different cultures, both to people who are born in the UK, but also to people whose different generations. So that research I did both in the northeast of England and also actually in Bristol, because there's a very lively and interesting community radio scene there, and a very wide range of minority groups. So we basically did some participatory research with different people, talked about how community radio was important to them and what led them to making connections across the world via radio. And we had colleagues in the Netherlands and in Germany and in Denmark who were also doing different kinds of radio research about transnational radio. And we had lots of ideas about how we could best sort of communicate this research to people. And obviously, as all of us were either radio nuts or radio producers or whatever, we wanted to have a kind of audio way of demonstrating the stories we'd found, the connections, the interesting things about sort of historical archives and so on. And we commissioned a company in Amsterdam who came up with Radio Garden, and as a sort of a place to plant, if you like, radio stations so that everyone could see the connections between them and could access them really easily. Yeah. And also embed sort of archive work and things like that. So when I first saw it, which was before it was released, I literally stayed up the whole night just surfing the airwaves.
Just listening to everything.
And then when we actually launched it right at the end of the research project, and we had absolutely no idea how, we knew it was amazing, but when it went public, it went viral. It literally went viral within a week, and there were millions of people listening to it, and the word was getting round. And in fact, it was launched on something like the 12th of December 2015, and then I spent Boxing Day on BBC Radio talking about it, because people were saying, what is this thing? It's amazing, So, and now what's exciting is, although the research project's finished and we've written a book about it and all that, the actual Radio Garden itself is still there. Yeah. And what we're doing now, this last year I've been working with the BBC, working with it as a tool to sort of renew young people's interest in radio, because as most people will know, young people are not listening to radio in the same way that I did when I grew up. Yeah. So that people are listening to podcasts more, they're listening to streaming services, and they might be listening to radio probably in the car or in the kitchen because their parents listen to it. But when young people are introduced to Radio Garden, they just light up, and it's been amazing. So I've been working with the BBC in their sort of STEM, this whole area of STEM, technology thing, and also with their Young Reporters project. And we're sort of promoting it as both as a technological sort of exciting thing, because but also as a way of them listening to radio all over the world. And the most exciting thing, I'll give you an example of this, is when the young person themselves comes from maybe a mixed race background or something like that, and or they're a recent immigrant, or they've got generations in their family who've travelled or lived in different countries. In Bristol, about a couple of months ago, there was a young woman who was born in Bristol, but her family came from Cyprus. And so she found quite a few stations in Cyprus, and she was listening with headphones, and she was, her eyes lit up, and then she was getting quite emotional. And she said, I'm listening to the same language that my grandmother speaks, and I'm listening to music that I know is part of my family's culture. She was really emotional and said, I'm going to tell all my family about this. But we're also finding that older people absolutely love it because, for instance, if they've got family abroad, they can listen to the same station as them simultaneously, which they find really exciting. I've been doing some work with a group in Sunderland called Young Asian Voices. They listening to all sorts of things. They go to America, they go to India, they go to Pakistan, and it sort of evokes an excitement and also a curiosity because you can sort of explore using Radio Garden. So we're still working with the sort of platform, if you like, and encouraging new users to use it and to sort of increase its use in schools and with community groups and so on. And we're always trying to get more people to, we've added, I think, something like 20,000 stations. I think the company in Amsterdam. So there is a box on there. So if someone's station wants to go on the garden, they can quite easily put the URL for the stream in there, and then they will be put on Radio Garden.
Yeah.
So particularly for smaller stations and community stations, and we've made a real effort to put lots of the smaller stations on. It's really, they can actually then link people. They can say, listen to X station on Radio Garden and just put the URL of that. And it will actually, we've got evidence that, it brings new listeners to those stations, both, particularly from outside the area. So it's sort of perpetuating that transnationality of radio listening.
We've got a couple of international students in my media group, and they were delighted when they could see that you could listen to a radio station in Hong Kong, and there was already that kind of excitement from there. And I was just thinking, if this had been around when I was doing my French A-levels, it would have been great, because if you're learning a foreign language, you can listen to a station in that language. And as well, it's something just as ridiculously small as if you're on holiday and you want to listen to the local match. If my dad wanted to listen to the Sunderland match from Spain or Portugal or whatever, he could still do that. And it's amazing. It does just occur to me when you're saying all of these incredible things that you've done, despite all of the different barriers that have been set up against you based on your gender. Do you think there are still barriers that are as bad as there were back in the 70s and the 80s?
It's clear that quite a lot has changed, but it's taken a long time. So this year, 2019, we now have breakfast presenters who are female on Radio 2 and on Radio 6 Music, and there are more, there are now more female presenters on most radio stations, and it feels like it's always been quite a battle for that, and if you don't, because it's a small industry and the jobs are relatively scarce, it is very competitive. And I think in those particularly in commercial radio, there is a tendency for men to take care of their own jobs and protect their own jobs and so on. So we are beginning to see many more women, obviously, in all sorts of different roles, and there's a lot of initiatives within the BBC and in some of the commercial industry to make sure that women there are the barriers that there have been. But like in any industry, there are still places where there are, sexism exists and people protect, they appoint people in their own image. And I think, like in any industry, you have to keep an eye on it. Otherwise, things can slip. And any large organisation, there can be barriers, and there are still pressures on women who get to senior management position, both to do that job and also to sort of be a role model and something like that. I think that there are, like again, in any industry, men are changing and, are more open to diverse workforces and that is how it should be. Over the years, the technology has got more accessible. Digital editing, for instance, has made things more accessible. I remember working in Bradford with a group of women, and at a time when digital editing has first started, and it meant that women from a particular Asian community were able to go home, and once the kids were in bed, they could edit at home. Now that was a significant change, whereas before they'd have had to have got childcare, come to the radio station, get into the studios and edit there. So, I mean, you might, people of young people now probably can't even to imagine that would have been a barrier, but it was. It really was. So now, so just that technological shift, both for being able to make a program on a computer, put together a program on a computer, and also upload it and be able to broadcast independently. It's not quite the same as radio, but it certainly has led to, I think, women being able just to get on with it and not have to get through a long career until they get, doing various jobs until they can get broadcasting what they want to broadcast. So it's a fantastic way of people being able to play with ideas and do things like that. Mm-hmm. So I think there is still sexism, there are still barriers, and I think really have to keep an eye on it, but there also are many more opportunities. Mm-hmm. And I think you reach a sort of critical mass where when you hear so many more women's voices and a much more varied voice, and this goes, in terms of class and accents and dialects and things like that it becomes a bit more normal to hear a Geordie accent, or to hear a South Asian accent, or to hear an Irish accent outside Ireland. So I think it's we've reached a point where there are still some sort of institutional issues, I would say, but I think that the industry has opened up a bit more. But it's still only. I mean, the other organisation I was involved in for a while was an organisation called Sound Women, which was there to support women in the radio industry, and that was set up only 10 years or so ago, when there was a series of awards where there were no female nominees in many of the categories, and it became clear that actually there were no female judges for those awards. These were major radio industry awards, and it was after that Sound Women was set up. And whereas when I was first starting campaigning around women in radio, it was very much always coming from the community and alternative sector, whereas Sound Women started by women at the BBC and in commercial radio. And I think there is a much more of an awareness now within every area of sound and radio that, it's less likely that men can get away with blatant sexism and things like that.
I mean, it's not radio, but when you linking back to what you were saying before, Steph McGovern being on BBC Breakfast was a huge noticeable shift for me, because it was the first time I'd really heard someone with an accent similar to mine on mainstream news.
Yes, I expect that was pretty empowering for you, wasn't it?
I did like it. I'm a huge fan of her, and I think seeing her on shows like Have I Got News For You is even greater, because it's taking her out of the safer BBC News zone and letting her loose a little bit is really funny, because she says a lot of things that I agree with, and seeing that kind of representation of a northern woman on the BBC. It doesn't happen a lot, but when it does, I'm a huge fan of it.
I know, and it is crazy. I think we do have such a tightly controlled media culture that it is so crazy that still it is unusual to hear those voices, and for them, for many, many years, it was okay to have a sort of an accent, but you had to modify it so that it wasn't too strong. Every time they open their mouths, it's saying to people with a similar background and accent and voice, it's okay for you to raise your voice, it's okay to speak. And, for so long, they were basically, there's actually a phrase for it, it's called symbolic annihilation, of women. That, if you don't hear that voice, it's invisible and therefore it's not valued.
With the rise of podcasting, it seems like everyone and their mother has a podcast nowadays. What do you think the future of radio is going to be if everyone could have a voice on like an audio voice? Do you think that radio might kind of die out a little bit, because radio has been around for so long? It almost seems inconceivable that it could be gone, but now we've got technologies that maybe might make it a little bit redundant.
Yes, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, ever since radio started, well, let's say ever since television started, people have been talking about the demise of radio, but every time there's a challenge to radio, it is a very resilient medium, and it sort of, I think because sound and the voice are so dominant in our culture and so important to us, and the intimacy of that is so important, that whereas radio is a carrier for those voices and stories and sounds and all that, radio as a carrier, I think, will change, and we're already seeing that. For instance, BBC, which is the world's major broadcaster, is encouraging people now to incorporate podcasting into their listening platforms.
That's
so,
BBC Sounds, isn't it?
Yeah, the BBC, for instance, is doing quite a lot of work incorporating Alexa and similar systems into radio and our digital lives. So even though I am a die-hard radio person, I am listening to radio very differently now, and I'm beginning to, I know people even of my elderly generation shifting so that they're not going, oh, I'll turn on a radio. They're saying, oh, I'll listen to that podcast. Now that is, and we're getting to the point where FM is beginning to, we're nearly at 50-50 where people are, listening. Digital DAB is will take over internet radio and so on. So it's always going to be interesting, but I do think fundamentally and actually maybe even more now, we like the purity and the sort of simplicity of sounds and not vision. I think we're so screen-oriented. I don't know about you, by the end of the week I'm cross-eyed.
Yeah.
And I actually think that in the same way that people are now listening to audiobooks a lot, I think sound is so important, and the voice and, music. I think we have to look at radio as not just a carrier. We look at the whole thing, and I think the sort of the legacy of radio is not dead, but the legacy and the history and the practices of radio, I think, will last quite a long time.
I don't tend to listen to podcasts that much, and the ones that I do, I listen to the radio, like the actual radio, all of the time. I've got a DAB radio in my room. The podcasts I tend to listen to are like live broadcasts, so they're almost a form of radio, but just online.
Well, there was recently, I heard this on the radio, but then I followed it up by listening to more of it as podcasters. There was a sort of dystopian drama about the future archives of sound, and it sort of goes like thousands of years into the future, where there is an archive of sounds, and some of those sounds are natural, like rainforest sounds, and people don't know what they are. So anyway, I'm sort of going up.
That sounds interesting, though.
Garden path, but it is. I think the importance of sound and voice and stories in people's lives, and I think will sustain different forms of radio, and I think the word radio may change as it has done. It's interesting that it's now BBC Sounds. And podcasting is a particular thing. So I think, who knows? Everything goes in cycles. Who would have guessed that cassettes might be coming back? Which is great, because I still haven't chucked out all my music, a lot of music cassettes. So,
I still have mine.
a very interesting and complex thing. The archives are very important now. Sound archives. How do we keep the sounds we love? How do we collect the music we love? How do we reassemble it, again and again, so that, we can listen to it again?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's so many interesting areas, and I also think, but if you think about if we're in a sort of climate crisis.
Yeah.
And one of the really interesting things, I can end on with a really interesting story about Radio Garden. Often when there are times of extreme weather or war or crisis, actually radio is often the last, the thing to last the longest. The FM, transmitters and people having their little radios, when there's no power and they've got batteries. And actually also we found that people have been using Radio Garden to find out whether radio stations are still operating. People abroad who were worried about their families were listening on Radio Guard, and they were hearing, when, for instance, there were no mobile phone signals, they were hearing people broadcasting messages through radios and finding out whether, sort of relaying messages and things like that. So it's interesting to think about what will, if we're in extreme circumstances, what will be left, and will we go back to very traditional forms of broadcasting?
That's a
I
really...
haven't really worked that one through, so it's not very well researched, but
It'll be all that's left, will be the radio waves. That's a really sombre note to end on. Thank you so much for talking
That's
to
all
me.
right.
Thank you so much for talking, full stop.
That's okay. Best of luck with your final mark and everything.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, have a nice night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.